I never thought a hike in Yellowstone would end like this. It was supposed to be a peaceful day in the backcountry, far from the crowded trails. Just me and my partner, surrounded by the wild beauty of the park. We had planned the hike for months, dreamed about it even. Yellowstone's rugged landscapes, towering trees, rushing streams, and wildlife all seemed like a paradise. And for most of the hike, it was. But that day changed everything. Started out like any other hike. We parked at the trailhead, gathered our gear, and set off into the wilderness. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, a light breeze, and the scent of pine trees thick in the air. The path was quiet, save for the occasional sound of birds singing, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and the crunch of dirt and gravel beneath our boots. We weren't on the main trail. We had veered off to explore a more remote part of the park. The trail was less maintained, the surroundings more untouched. A true escape from the world. It felt good to get away from the usual hustle, to be immersed in the forest, with the towering pines all around us and the distant peaks rising above. We walked for hours, taking in the beauty of the place. Every now and then, we'd stop to take photos or just enjoy the silence. Occasionally, we'd pass by a stream or a small clearing where the sunlight filtered through the branches, casting a golden glow on the forest floor. We barely saw any other hikers. It felt like we had the entire park to ourselves. The farther we went, the more isolated we felt. We were deep into the backcountry, where the sounds of the world faded away. It was pure wilderness, untouched, unspoiled, and intimidating in its vastness. It was around midday when we came to a large open area, a meadow surrounded by thick forest. The grass was tall, swaying in the wind, and wildflowers dotted the landscape in bursts of color. It was quiet here, a stark contrast to the peaceful hum of the forest we'd just come from. As we walked through the meadow, something caught my eye, a movement in the distance. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a few birds or small animals, but then I saw more movement, large shapes shifting through the tall grass. My heart skipped a beat. Bison, a whole herd of them, grazing peacefully. I whispered to my partner, but she had already noticed too. We both stopped and watched for a moment, admiring the creatures from a distance. The bison were a sight to behold, massive animals, their thick brown fur rippling with every step. Some of them were grazing, others standing tall, their heads held high, looking out into the distance. They seemed calm, even docile, as they moved slowly through the meadow. I remember thinking how lucky we were to see them up close. Bison aren't always easy to spot, especially in such a remote area. We stood there for a while, watching them from the edge of the meadow, both of us excited by the encounter. We didn't want to disturb them, but we also didn't want to leave without taking in the moment. After a few minutes, we decided to move on slowly and carefully to give them space. That's when things started to go wrong. I don't know what exactly caused it. Maybe we moved too quickly or we got too close. Maybe one of the bison felt threatened, or maybe it was just an instinctual reaction. But suddenly, everything changed. A deep, guttural grunt broke the silence. A bison at the front of the herd raised its head, its eyes narrowing. Then, without warning, it charged. The massive animal came toward us with surprising speed, its hooves pounding the earth like a thunderclap. My heart raced as I turned to my partner, and we both began to back away quickly, fear gripping us like a vice. I've heard about how dangerous bison can be, but I never imagined it would happen like this. It's easy to forget how fast they can move and how aggressive they can become when they feel threatened. This wasn't the slow-moving, docile bison we had been watching moments earlier. This was a wild animal, driven by a sudden surge of anger or fear. We sprinted as fast as we could, but the bison wasn't stopping. It was gaining on us. I could hear the pounding of its hooves behind us, getting louder with every step. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, my legs burning as I pushed myself harder. I glanced over my shoulder, and the sight made my blood run cold. The herd was following us. More than one bison now, all charging toward us with alarming speed. There was no time to think. We were running blind, darting between the tall grass and the scattered trees, hoping the bison would lose sight of us. But they didn't. The first one was gaining fast. I could see it now, the massive animal, its horns lowered, eyes wild and furious. I knew we had to do something, anything, to escape. We dove toward the nearest trees, ducking behind their trunks for cover. I heard the bison crash through the brush behind us, its heavy breathing loud in the still air. We held our breath, praying it wouldn't find us. The minutes felt like hours. I could hear the sound of the herd moving around us, their hooves thundering as they continued to search for us. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing. I couldn't believe this was happening. Through the gaps in the trees, I caught a glimpse of the herd. The bison were moving in a slow circle around us, trying to pinpoint our location. I knew we couldn't stay hidden forever. The fear of being trampled, of being caught in the middle of a herd of agitated bison, was paralyzing. "We need to move now," I whispered to my partner, though I wasn't sure if she could hear me. My voice was barely a breath. We had no choice but to make a run for it. We darted from tree to tree, zigzagging to throw off their pursuit. I could feel my legs screaming in pain, but I didn't stop. There was no time for hesitation. Finally, we broke through the trees and saw it, the trailhead. We were close. The herd was still behind us, but the gap was widening. We pushed harder, adrenaline flooding our veins, until we reached the trail. We didn't look back as we sprinted down the path, the safety of the familiar trailhead within reach. Our breath was ragged, our bodies exhausted, but we didn't stop until we were out of sight of the meadow. It wasn't until we were safely on the main trail, panting and trembling, that the reality of what had just happened started to sink in. We had escaped by sheer luck. There was no way to know what could have happened if the bison had been more persistent. We were lucky, and it wasn't lost on me how easily things could have turned fatal. A single wrong step, a single miscalculation, and we could have been caught in the middle of a stampede. We didn't speak much as we made our way back to the car. The silence between us was heavy, thick with the weight of what had just occurred. Neither of us felt like celebrating anymore. We had experienced firsthand how dangerous this wild place could be. It wasn't the peaceful, serene wilderness we had envisioned. It was wild, untamed, and at times it could be downright unforgiving. When we finally made it back to the car, I looked out at the mountains, at the forest that had once seemed so welcoming, so peaceful. And while I still loved the park, I couldn't help but feel a deep, unsettling respect for the power of nature. We had been lucky that day, but others might not be. That experience stayed with me long after we left Yellowstone. It wasn't just the fear, though that was part of it. It was the realization of how unpredictable wildlife could be. You can't prepare for every eventuality, no matter how much you read or how many safety tips you follow. Nature doesn't care about your plans. It will do what it does, regardless of your expectations. We never talked about it much after we left, but I know it changed both of us. It reminded us both that no matter how much you love the outdoors, you have to respect it. Always. That encounter with the bison was a stark reminder that even the most peaceful creatures can be dangerous when provoked. And in a place as vast and wild as Yellowstone, you are never truly in control. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened to Karen Sykes. I was just one of the many people who read about it in the news at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. I'd hiked near Mount Rainier before, even did a solo hike up there once, so the idea of someone like Karen, an experienced hiker, going missing struck me as more than just tragic. It was strange, eerie even, and what I learned about her death, even stranger. It was like a haunting reminder of how unpredictable and unforgiving the wilderness can be, no matter how much you know about it. Karen had been hiking solo. This wasn't her first time. She had a reputation among local hiking groups. She knew the mountains like the back of her hand, and people trusted her expertise. It was 2014, and she had been exploring around Mount Rainier, an area known for its rugged beauty but also its danger. It wasn't the kind of hike where you could just wander around without knowing the terrain. The mountains' weather changes quickly, and the paths can be steep and unforgiving. But Karen She had been there before, and she'd been to places most people would shy away from. That's why, when she went missing, people were stunned. Karen Sykes, of all people, vanishing into thin air. I can still picture her, even though I never met her personally. Her name was known in the hiking community, her face on some of the local trail groups. She had a reputation for her ability to navigate the wild, for her calm demeanor and her no-nonsense approach to the mountains. So when Karen left a note behind saying she was going for a solo hike around Mount Rainier, no one thought anything of it. It wasn't unusual, but what followed was far from the peaceful, solitary experience she'd been accustomed to. The note was simple. Heading out for a solo hike today. Don't worry if I don't check in. Just taking a short trip. I'll be fine. Karen had always been the type to keep a low profile on the trail. She didn't carry much gear, just the essentials. A map, a compass, a small pack with food and water. She knew what she needed, and she knew how to survive in the wild. There were no red flags, no signs that would have made anyone think she wouldn't come back. But as the hours turned into days, the search teams grew concerned. They combed the surrounding areas near Mount Rainier, calling out her name, their voices drowned out by the sound of rushing streams and the wind in the trees. They searched day and night, braving the rough terrain, trying to piece together what could have happened. How could someone like Karen, who had hiked this area countless times, simply disappear? I remember reading the reports. The first few days, they hadn't found any trace of her. Then, the search expanded, and they started finding bits and pieces of her trail. A worn shoe, a dropped water bottle, the occasional faint footprint. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the search going. The thought that someone so seasoned could get lost like this, lost to the wilderness, didn't sit right with anyone. I couldn't help but think of the places I'd been when hiking, the spots that looked easy but could hide danger. The false sense of security you sometimes get when you've been on enough trails, when you think you know every turn, every rock, every tree. You start to believe that the wilderness, for all its power, is just a place you can navigate. You forget how quickly it can turn on you. Karen's body was found several days later, in a remote area that no one had expected her to be in. The place was so isolated, it felt like she had wandered off course entirely. When they discovered her, it wasn't like they were looking for signs of violence. There were no visible injuries, no sign that someone had attacked her. It didn't make sense. She was just gone. The body had been discovered at the bottom of a slope, in an area that was hard to access. No obvious signs of what had happened. No broken bones. No cuts, no bruises. No signs of a struggle. But Karen was dead. The lack of visible injuries was one of the things that unnerved everyone who saw the scene. At first, they thought maybe she'd gotten lost, gotten disoriented in the wilderness. It happens. You lose track of time, you wander off the trail, maybe you slip in the wet terrain. But even then, it didn't add up. How could someone who knew the trail so well, who was so experienced, end up in such an out-of-the-way place? The investigators started piecing it together slowly. Karen's body was found in a spot that was difficult to reach, tucked between boulders. The ground around her body was soft, which suggested she might have fallen. But there were no signs of a major fall, nothing that would have broken her bones or caused a fatal injury. The coroner couldn't find anything that would explain her death. There was no trauma, no indication that she'd been attacked by an animal. The only thing they could figure was that she had become disoriented, maybe even confused by the landscape. She might have slipped or tripped, and that was the end of it. She hadn't been able to call for help. She had just fallen. But there were still so many questions. Why had she gone so far off course? What could have caused her to wander into such a remote area, far from any marked trails? Even experienced hikers make mistakes, but this seemed too far, too strange. I thought back to my own time hiking in the Cascades and what the mountains could do to your sense of direction. I remembered the thick, silent fog that rolled in suddenly, swallowing everything in its path. The way the trees blurred into one another, creating false trails that tricked the mind. It's easy to get lost when you don't have a clear sense of where you are. You start doubting your own bearings. You walk in circles without even realizing it. Your mind starts to play tricks on you. Could have been something like that. Maybe Karen had become confused, disoriented by the rugged terrain. It's not an uncommon experience in the mountains, especially when the weather starts to shift unpredictably. The weather on Mount Rainier can change in an instant, clouding your view and making landmarks disappear. Maybe Karen had thought she was headed back to a familiar place when she wasn't. But what really hit me, the part that I couldn't stop thinking about, was how easily this could have happened to anyone. I've hiked alone before, just like Karen. I've been in places where I knew exactly where I was and places where I had no idea. But I had the privilege of knowing that I could turn back at any point, that I could go home at the end of the day. Karen didn't have that chance. Whatever happened that day, whether it was a misstep or a moment of confusion, it claimed her life in a way that was almost invisible. No signs of struggle, no marks on her body. She just faded away, lost to the wilderness. It was humbling. It's a harsh reminder that nature doesn't care how much you know. You could be an expert like Karen and still fall victim to its unpredictable power. The wilderness doesn't make exceptions. It doesn't matter if you've hiked every trail or if you've been in every weather condition. One wrong move, one moment of disorientation, and it's over. Karen's death, as tragic and mysterious as it was, wasn't some supernatural event. It was the raw, unforgiving nature of the wilderness. A reminder that even the most experienced can fall prey to it. When the search teams found Karen's body, it felt like a blow to the entire hiking community. No one expected something like this to happen to someone like her. But it happens, and it's something we all have to accept. No one is immune to the dangers of the wilderness. And no matter how much you prepare, no matter how much you study the terrain, there's always the chance that something unexpected will happen. I think about Karen every time I go out on a solo hike. It's not about fear, it's about respect. Respect for the mountain, for the wilderness, for the unpredictability of it all. I can't help but wonder if she knew something, deep down, about the risks she was taking. Maybe she was always aware of how quickly things could change, but she loved the mountains so much that she couldn't stay away, even when she knew how fragile her position could be. So when I step onto a trail, I carry that with me. I remember Karen, and I remember that no matter how much experience you have, the wilderness is always more powerful than any of us. We're just visitors, and sometimes the mountain decides it's time for us to go. I was alone in the Pyrenees Mountains, the jagged peaks rising all around me, the scent of pine trees mixed with the earthy musk of the trail. It was supposed to be a peaceful hike, just me and the wilderness. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of spending time away from the world, with only my backpack and the rustling of leaves for company, felt like the perfect escape. The mountains were always my place of solace, my way of getting away from everything that weighed me down. I was used to hiking alone. I enjoyed the quiet solitude, the way the world seemed to disappear when I stepped onto the trail. The mountains had always felt safe to me, almost like a sanctuary. I had done solo hikes before, in the Alps, in the Pyrenees, even in remote forests. Every time, it felt like I could breathe easier, like the weight of the world lifted off my shoulders. But that day, something felt different. It wasn't the weather, no, the sky was clear, the sun bright. It wasn't the trail either. It was a familiar one I had hiked before. It was just a sense I couldn't shake, a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was the strange silence that surrounded me, the kind of silence that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. Or maybe it was the way the trees seemed to lean in, their branches twisted and dark. I don't know. I just couldn't get rid of that feeling. I kept walking, pushing the thoughts aside as I focused on the path ahead. The rocks crunched under my boots, and the wind whispered through the trees. But even though everything appeared normal, I couldn't escape the feeling that someone was watching me. I didn't want to acknowledge it. Maybe it was just my imagination. After all, the mountains were full of hikers, and I wasn't the only one on the trail. I passed a few people along the way, other solo hikers like me, and some small groups making their way up the winding paths. Everyone was polite, exchanging brief smiles and nods before continuing on their way. It wasn't unusual for the Pyrenees to be busy during this time of year, and it didn't bother me. I was used to sharing the trails with strangers. Then, just as the trail began to curve around a steep ridge, I saw him, a man hiking alone. He was standing off to the side, looking down at the ground, his body language stiff and tense. He didn't notice me at first, so I slowed my pace, watching him closely. Something about his posture made me uneasy. He wasn't simply resting or taking in the view like the others. His eyes darted around nervously, and he kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other as if waiting for something or someone. I felt a sudden unease, like a knot tightening in my stomach. I should have turned around, I realize now. I should have trusted my instincts and walked back to the last group of hikers I'd passed. But I didn't. I kept moving forward, too far from the trailhead to turn back, too deep into the mountains to consider returning the way I came. As I drew closer, the man finally noticed me. His eyes locked onto mine, and he gave a strange, almost forced smile. I nodded politely, trying to ignore the unease growing inside me. But then, as I passed him, something shifted. He stepped into my path, blocking my way. My heart started pounding in my chest, a sudden panic surging through me. I was alone, and I had no one around to help if something went wrong. The man's smile faltered, and his eyes hardened. "It's a beautiful day," he said, his voice too loud, too forced. It was the kind of conversation you have when you're trying too hard to make things feel normal. I nodded again, taking a step back, trying to sidestep him. "Yeah, it is." But he didn't move. Instead, he took a step forward, closing the gap between us. "Are you hiking alone?" he asked, his voice low now, almost a whisper. There was something unsettling in his tone, something that made my blood run cold. I instinctively glanced around, hoping for another hiker to appear, but the trail was empty. We were alone in the mountains, and the thought of it hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't answer immediately, and in that split second of hesitation, he took another step forward. His presence was suddenly overwhelming, his body filling the space between us. "I'm fine," I said, my voice shaky despite my attempt to sound calm. I tried to move past him, but he stepped in front of me again. "Are you sure you're all right?" His words dripped with something I couldn't quite place, something sinister. His eyes flicked down to my backpack, then to my face, then back to my backpack. The silence between us grew thicker, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "I'm fine," I said again, this time more forcefully, but I was lying. I wasn't fine. I could feel the situation slipping from my control, and I needed to get away. The man's face twisted into a cruel grin, his eyes narrowing. I knew in that moment I was in trouble. My heart raced as adrenaline surged through my veins. I took a step back, then another, but he was faster. In one swift motion, he lunged at me, grabbing my arm with a vice-like grip. I screamed, but it was muffled by the mountains, swallowed by the towering peaks. My body instinctively reacted, trying to pull away, but his strength was overwhelming. He twisted my arm behind my back, and I felt pain shoot through my shoulder. My breath hitched in my chest as I realized how utterly powerless I was in that moment. Panic flooded my mind. I was alone. No one was coming to help. The thought felt suffocating. The ground beneath me seemed to tilt, and for a moment, everything went silent. I had to do something. I fought back with everything I had, kicking at his shins, hitting him with my free hand, but he barely flinched. His grip tightened, pulling me closer, and I could feel the weight of him behind me, the heat of his breath on my neck. The fear coursing through my body was pure and primal. "Stop fighting," he hissed in my ear. "This will be easier if you just listen." But I couldn't let him win. I had to escape. In a desperate attempt, I stomped down hard with my foot, hitting the side of his knee. He grunted in pain, loosening his grip just enough for me to twist free. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but I didn't stop. I ran. The sound of my boots pounding against the dirt trail echoed through the trees. I didn't dare look back. I didn't dare slow down. The adrenaline was pushing me forward, but I could feel the weight of fear pressing on my chest, suffocating me. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep running. I didn't stop for what felt like hours. My legs burned, my breath ragged in my lungs, but I couldn't afford to slow down. The thought of what had just happened, of the man chasing me, was enough to keep me moving. Couldn't let him catch me. I couldn't be another statistic. Finally, I saw movement ahead. A small group of hikers appeared on the trail, and for the first time since it all began, I felt a flicker of hope. I ran towards them, shouting for help. My words tumbled out in a jumbled mess, but they understood. They saw the fear in my eyes. They took me in, offering me water and comfort, their presence a barrier between me and whatever nightmare I had just escaped. I collapsed onto the ground, my body trembling from the shock of everything that had happened. The hikers stayed with me, reassuring me, making sure I was okay, though I felt anything but okay. They helped me back to the trailhead, where I would later meet authorities. It wasn't until later that I learned what had truly happened. The man I had encountered on the trail, his name was Luis Martino, had been planning his attack for weeks. He had carefully chosen his location, his victim, and the timing. He had stalked the mountains, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I was just another hiker passing through, and he had seen an opportunity. The police never found him. He had disappeared into the mountains, and despite their search efforts, he was never caught. It wasn't until weeks later that his body was found, not from a fall, but from the effects of dehydration and exhaustion. The authorities believed he had died while trying to flee, but they never found out for sure what happened. What was clear, though, was that I was one of the lucky ones. Many others weren't so fortunate. I never went back to the Pyrenees after that. The mountains that had once been my refuge became a haunting memory. I still hike, but I do it differently now. I tell someone where I'm going, when I'll be back. I carry a phone. I make sure I'm never alone for too long. I never let my guard down, not even for a second. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the sound of my boots on the trail, my breath ragged in my chest, the fear that consumed me in those long moments when I wasn't sure I would make it out alive. But I did. I survived. And I won't let anyone forget that. I started the day as usual, with the morning light filtering through the dense trees of the Appalachian Trail in Maine. The weather was warm, typical for July, with the sun casting long, dappled shadows on the ground. The air smelled earthy, with a hint of pine and damp soil. My husband, George, was already a few hundred yards ahead of me as we hiked. He was a faster walker than I was, but he never complained, always walking ahead with his steady pace. We had been hiking together on the trail for days now, our backpacks loaded with everything we needed to survive. I had been excited about this section of the trail, the rugged terrain and the challenge of it, though the days were getting long, and I was starting to feel the weight of the miles in my legs. That morning, I felt the familiar urge to relieve myself. The trail was empty, and the sun had just begun to climb higher, pushing the coolness of the morning away. It had been a few miles since our last break, so I decided it was a good spot to step off the main trail. George was ahead, and I wasn't worried. I knew he'd be waiting for me a little further on. I wandered a short distance off the path, just enough to have some privacy. The dense trees and underbrush surrounded me, muffling the world around me. As I squatted, the sound of the wind in the branches above was the only thing I could hear. But when I stood up to return to the trail, something felt off. The trail was no longer visible. I squinted, trying to spot the familiar markers, the blazes that painted the trees, but they weren't where they should have been. The thick undergrowth was everywhere, and in that moment, I realized I had strayed farther than I intended. I hesitated for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. It wasn't like me to panic, but I was starting to feel a tightness in my chest. I called out for George, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the forest. No response. I called again, louder this time, but all I could hear was the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. No footsteps, no answer. For a few minutes, I stood still, trying to get my bearings. I turned in slow circles, scanning the surroundings, but everything looked the same. The trail should have been just a few steps away, but I couldn't see it. I decided to take a few steps in one direction, thinking I might find it. Each step felt like it took me further from where I was supposed to be. I pushed through the brush, stepping over rocks, twisting my ankles on hidden roots. After a few more minutes, I stopped and took a breath. This was silly, I thought. All I had to do was turn around and retrace my steps. I'd find George, and we'd laugh about how lost I had gotten. But when I turned around, the world felt more alien than before. The trees looked different, the angles seemed wrong. My heart started to pound in my chest, and I began walking faster, back in the direction I thought I had come from. The forest closed in around me, and soon the path was no longer in sight. I was lost. I stood still for a moment, feeling the overwhelming sense of dread creeping up my spine. I tried to call out again, but my voice cracked, as if the very air was thick and heavy. It felt like the forest itself was swallowing my words, trapping them before they could reach George. I didn't know how far he had gone, but I had no choice but to move forward. For hours I walked. The sunlight grew harsher as it climbed higher, and the trees cast long, creeping shadows. The sweat on my back made my shirt cling to my skin, and my legs began to ache. The trail was nowhere to be found. I had thought that if I walked long enough, I would find it again. Maybe it had just been a few feet away. But after a while, I started to realize it wasn't that simple. The panic began to set in. My mind raced through the possibilities. George would be worried. He would know something was wrong. He'd come looking for me. But then I realized I didn't even know which direction he had gone. I had no idea how to retrace my steps. No way of knowing if I was even walking in the right direction. The trees, the rocks, the dirt beneath my feet, they all looked the same. I had to stop. I was too tired to keep going without a plan. I found a small clearing, sat down, and pulled out my water bottle. I drank deeply, my hands shaking as I held it. I knew I needed to stay calm, but the fear gnawed at me. How could I have gotten so turned around? How could I have been so careless? That night, I made a shelter of sorts, using branches and leaves to cover myself. I curled up as best I could under the canopy of trees, trying to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, and I kept hearing things moving just outside the small space I had made for myself. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of terror through my body. I told myself it was just animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest was alive with sounds, of creatures moving in the night, the wind in the trees, and the occasional distant cry of an owl. But the worst sound, by far, was the silence that followed each noise, the stillness that seemed to hang in the air afterward, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The next day, I woke early, my body stiff from the uncomfortable position I had slept in. I gathered my things and tried to keep moving, but the fear was starting to seep into my bones. It had been over 24 hours since I'd stepped off the trail, and I hadn't seen a soul. No sign of George, no sign of the trail. I started marking the trees as I walked, carving small notches into the bark with my pocket knife to help me keep track of where I had been. I didn't know how much time passed. Days began to blur together. I rationed my food carefully, knowing that I had to make it last. The landscape changed around me, but it always felt the same. Dense woods, a maze of trees and rocks. The sun became both my enemy and my guide, moving across the sky as I wandered, trying to follow what I thought might be a path. But every day, I found myself further and further from where I had started. I wrote in my journal each night, keeping track of the days. At first, I wrote down everything, what I had seen, what I had done, how I had felt. But as the days wore on, my entries grew more desperate, more frantic. The isolation was starting to eat away at me. I had never been alone like this before, never felt so utterly powerless. Each morning, I told myself I would find my way back. But the more I searched, the more lost I became. I began to see things. Shadows that didn't belong, movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just exhaustion, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But it was more than that. The forest felt wrong, like it was alive in ways I couldn't explain. The trees seemed to shift, their trunks twisting in unnatural angles, their branches reaching out like long, skeletal fingers. I never saw another person. I never heard a voice. The silence was unbearable. My thoughts grew darker, and I realized how truly alone I was. Every attempt to find the trail only led me deeper into the wilderness. By the time I had been lost for 2 weeks, I was no longer the same person. The fear that had once been sharp and immediate had become a dull, constant ache. I was weaker, slower, but still trying to find a way out. I could barely bring myself to write in the journal anymore, the words feeling empty as I marked another day. I had stopped hoping for rescue. I had stopped hoping for anything. When they finally found me 2 years later, it was as if the forest had kept me locked away for all that time. My body was discovered near the trail, not far from where I had stepped off, but it was too late. No one had been able to hear my cries for help or see my signals in the distance. In the end, the wilderness had swallowed me whole, and I had become just another lost soul in its endless expanse. George had searched for me, but the trail had claimed me. My story was a sad, silent reminder of how easy it was to be swallowed by the forest, how easy it was to be lost in the wilderness alone. There were no ghosts, no mysterious forces, just the harsh reality of what it meant to be lost, to be forgotten in a place where no one could hear your calls. The wilderness had taken me, and it gave nothing back. This time last year, I went on a night hike in the desert with 2 friends and a little dog named Pickle. We had done a few of these UV scorpion hunts before. You shine a black light out in the brush and see those little guys glow bright blue like neon signs in the dark. It felt like a fun and weird way to kill a few hours. Plus, the desert at night has this eerie quiet that can feel kind of magical if you're in the right headspace. We started the hike just after dusk. It was still warm, the air dry and a little dusty. We parked at a small trailhead lot that barely held 3 or 4 cars. The sun had just dipped behind the hills, and we could feel the heat still trapped in the rocks and sand. We had headlamps, flashlights, and the UV light. We were dressed light, long sleeves mostly just to keep the bugs off, with good boots and water strapped on. It wasn't a long hike, maybe a few miles in and out, mostly flat with little elevation, winding through low scrub, cactus, and loose sand. The dog, Pickle, was this little wiry thing, a mutt with maybe some terrier in her. She wore this tiny LED collar that blinked blue every couple of seconds. Just this little strobe bouncing through the brush. We joked that she'd scare off everything bigger than a mouse, but truthfully she didn't even bark unless something really got her going. We walked for about 1.5 miles, poking around the rocks, lighting up bark scorpions and the odd spider that showed up under the UV. They never stopped being creepy with that glow. The air smelled like dust and creosote. Every once in a while you could hear a night bird call or the faint skitter of something moving off in the brush. Mostly it was quiet. No wind, no moon yet. I was taking up the rear. I liked it that way. Gave me a little space to swing the blacklight back and forth and move slower. The middle person had the other UV light, and the one in front had the dog. We kept it loose but not too spread out, maybe 10 feet between us. About 2 miles in, we decided to turn around. We'd seen some good scorpions, taken a few pictures, and figured we'd head back before it got too late. We were just starting the walk back when something felt wrong. Not loud, just off. The way the scrub looked, the way the air felt, even the silence had shifted. I didn't say anything at first, just kept walking. But a few minutes later, as we hit a curve in the trail where the brush got thicker, I looked behind us. Just a routine glance. That's when I saw something big jump off the trail. It wasn't loud, but I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A heavy shift of weight, like something muscular and quick moving through the dark. I spun around with the headlamp and caught just a bit of it, a low form diving off into the cactus and brush. I couldn't see a face or eyes, but I saw the back and part of a long tail. At first I tried to tell myself it was a deer or maybe a javelina, but the way it moved was different. Smoother, heavier, and quiet. Too quiet. I stopped walking, let my friends get a few feet ahead before I told them what I'd seen. They didn't believe me right away, thought maybe I spooked myself. But I knew what I saw. We kept moving, but slower now. Tighter. Everyone a little more alert. I kept turning around every 30 seconds or so. Nothing, just dark trail and scrub. Then, maybe a minute later, the middle person gasped and froze. Their headlamp swung left off the trail and lit up a patch of brush. We all stopped. Nobody said anything. We didn't need to. There it was. Not fully out in the open, but lit enough to see the back. Low, sleek, powerful. Tail like a whip. Fur the color of sand and shade. A mountain lion. It was crouched about 10 feet off the trail, still watching us. It didn't move. We didn't move. Pickle was quiet, ears up but not barking. I don't know if that made it better or worse. We slowly backed up a few steps, grouped tight. No one turned their back. I took the rear again, but this time I walked backwards. We kept moving, careful steps. It didn't follow immediately. I don't know if it slipped into the brush again or stayed in place. We didn't see it, but we felt it. Every 10 or 20 yards I'd stop and look behind. Nothing visible, but the tension stayed. That heavy feeling of being watched. You don't forget that. We were about a quarter mile from the trailhead, maybe a 5 or 6 minute walk, but it felt longer than the whole hike before it. Every noise made us jump. Every brush of cactus or scuff of boot sounded too loud. Pickle started glancing behind us too, her little blue collar still blinking like a heartbeat in the dark. I don't know if the cat followed us the whole way. I think it did. At one point, I heard something soft and quick in the brush off to the side, pacing us. It wouldn't take much for it to get close, just a few quick steps. But it didn't. Not yet. When we finally reached the trailhead parking lot, I felt a bit of relief, like crossing an invisible line into something safer. There was only one other car in the lot, parked off to the side with its lights off. Somebody was in there, probably a couple trying to stay unnoticed. We didn't think, we just needed light. The person in front walked up and knocked on the window. It took a second, but the driver rolled it down, startled and clearly not expecting company. Whatever they were doing, they weren't happy to be interrupted. But when the front hiker quickly pointed toward the trail and asked for the headlights, the driver didn't argue. I think he saw something in our faces. Maybe the way we were bunched up, breathing heavy, heads constantly swiveling. The car lights flicked on and lit up the edge of the trail, the scrub just off to the right. And there it was, full-grown mountain lion, maybe 20 feet away, low to the ground but not hiding anymore. Ears up, tail twitching once, eyes catching the light, not glowing like in the movies but still reflective enough to catch. It stared at us for a heartbeat, then bolted. Not in a panic, not crashing through the brush. Just gone. One smooth movement and it disappeared into the dark. We stood there for a while. No one said anything. Even Pickle stayed still, pressed against her owner's legs. The headlights stayed on. I felt like I could finally breathe again, but only shallow. My heart was still thumping. Not from the scare exactly, but from the realization that it had followed us all that way. Close, quiet, hidden. It hadn't gone for the dog, even though she would have been easy. It hadn't charged or growled. It just stalked us, watched, waited. It knew we knew at some point, and it still stayed close. That's the part that sticks with me the most. It didn't act scared. It wasn't deterred until it was fully exposed. After a while, we thanked the guy in the car and got into our own. Locked the doors, even though that wouldn't have done much against something like that. Drove home mostly quiet. I think we were all processing in our own way. Since then, we haven't done many scorpion hunts. A few, maybe, but nothing that deep into the brush. Not without a lot more prep. Not without being more aware. I still hike, still love the desert. But now I look behind me more often. I listen harder. That feeling of something following hasn't quite left me. Even in the daylight. Sometimes it's not about being attacked or chased. Sometimes the scariest thing is knowing how close something got without you hearing a thing. How easily it could have gone different if the cat had made a different choice. How a little blue blinking collar in the dark might have been the only reason we got home without losing something or someone. I don't need to make it a bigger story than it is. There were no ghosts, no mystery, just a mountain lion, just us. But it was real, and I'll never forget the way the brush moved or the way its body looked under that headlamp. Smooth, ready, watching. I don't think about scorpions the same way anymore. It was sometime in the late 90s. I was in my junior year of high school, still caught in that strange, in-between place where you think you know everything but in reality you don't know shit. It was spring break, I think, or maybe just a weekend that felt like freedom. The kind of warm Arizona day that made you forget you had homework or parents or any real responsibilities. My best friend and I had made plans to hike up Usery Mountain, just on the eastern edge of Mesa. We'd been there before, but this time felt different. We had 2 girls with us. Girls we liked, the kind of liked where you try not to say anything too stupid and pretend you're tougher than you really are. Usery Mountain isn't massive, but it has this cave near the top called the Wind Cave. It's not really a cave, more like a big hollowed-out space in the rock where the wind whips through and gives you a break from the sun. We made it up there without much trouble. The 4 of us sat for a while, catching our breath, drinking water, flirting in that awkward teenage way. Someone brought a bag of gummy worms, and we passed it around, laughing and being loud in that way that only teenagers in the desert can get away with. But the Wind Cave wasn't enough for us that day. We were riding the high of youth and spring air, and someone, maybe me, maybe my buddy, said, "Let's keep going." So we did. We scrambled up past the cave, through patches of loose rock and scraggly desert brush, all the way to the summit. The trail gets sketchier past the Wind Cave, less of a trail and more of a direction. You have to use your hands, grab whatever rock is solid. Hope you don't put your foot on a cactus or loose gravel. By the time we reached the top, the city below looked like a toy model. Small houses, tiny roads, all of it swallowed in a hazy yellow light from the lowering sun. The wind up there never stops. It just moves around you, low and steady, like the mountain is breathing. The girls were sitting on a rock ledge, legs dangling over the edge, and my friend and I were poking around the summit area, just doing what boys do. We looked under rocks, tossed pebbles down into the canyon, climbed a little higher, even though we were already high enough. That's when my buddy spotted it. A rusty, old Altoids tin sitting on a flat rock, tucked just slightly under a ledge like someone had placed it there on purpose, but didn't want it to blow away. He picked it up, shook it. It rattled a bit. He opened it, and inside were 2 folded up pieces of white paper. They were yellowed slightly, like they'd been up there for a while but not so long that the ink had faded. No moisture damage, no signs of animal chewing, just 2 sheets neatly folded. He laid them out flat on a rock. The first one was a pencil sketch, crude but clearly drawn with intention. It showed the view from where we were sitting, the rolling brown desert, the little squares of the city, and the superstitions in the distance. Underneath it, scrawled in tight letters, it said, "The last view from Daniel's eyes, April 12th, 1997. The second sheet was worse. It was an apology letter, written in pen, ballpoint, blue ink. No greeting, no signature, just a list of names and things this person was sorry for. Sorry to his mom for yelling. Sorry to a girl named Kelly for never telling her how he felt. Sorry to someone named Jeff for stealing his bike in 7th grade. Sorry to a teacher for faking sick." Dozens of these little confessions, one after another, raw and kind of childish in the way they were phrased. But honest, painfully honest. We didn't speak for a while. The girls had walked over to see what we were looking at. They read the papers, too. One of them got quiet and walked away. The other stayed and stared at the drawing. My friend and I looked at each other and said the obvious thing without saying it. This was a suicide note. Someone had come up here to die. And I don't know what it was. Maybe a mix of fear and curiosity or just that youthful sense of invincibility. But we started looking. The backside of Usery drops down into rougher, less traveled terrain. We started scanning it, walking the edge, looking for bones or scraps of fabric or anything that didn't belong to the desert. But the thing about the Sonoran Desert is, it doesn't give up its secrets easily. The wind covers footprints. The animals take what they find. The sun bleaches everything. We found nothing. No trace. No remains. No more paper. No backpack. No sign of anyone having been there, aside from that tin and the words inside. We hiked down before dark. It was quiet on the way back. The girls didn't talk much. My buddy and I kept looking over our shoulders like we expected someone to be following us. But no one was. Back then, the internet was around, but it wasn't like it is now. No Google, no social media, no easy way to search for missing persons or public records unless you knew where to look. So a few days later, after the girls had stopped answering our calls and school had resumed, we went to the Mesa Public Library. We asked the lady at the counter about newspapers and she led us to the microfiche machine. It was kind of exciting at first. The whirring of the machine, the tiny screens, scanning through old headlines and dates like we were detectives. Encyclopedia Brown, just like those books we used to read. We focused on the month listed on the drawing, then the next few months after that. We were looking for any mention of a missing person named Daniel or a suicide or anything that might line up. There were a few stories of missing hikers, but none from usury. One report of a teenager found dead in the superstitions, but the name didn't match, and the circumstances were different. Eventually, we gave up, not because we weren't interested, but because we didn't know what else to do. We didn't have any other clues, and life kept moving. Tests to take, girls to chase, parents to dodge. Summer came and went. I never really stopped thinking about that tin, though. I would bring it up sometimes, when my buddy and I were hanging out late at night, sitting on his back porch drinking soda and talking about the future. He always kept it in his room, on a shelf behind his books. One time he told me he looked through the note again and noticed a name on there that sounded familiar, like someone from our middle school, but he couldn't place it exactly. After high school, we drifted apart. He moved out of state for college. I stayed local, worked some jobs, got into different things. We talked once or twice after that, maybe around the time Facebook started catching on. He told me he still had the tin, still wondered about the guy who wrote it. Years passed. I got older, got a job, a mortgage, all the boring adult stuff. But every now and then, something would trigger the memory. A hike, a mention of usury, that low, whistling wind you hear when you're high up and the air gets thin. And I'd think about that kid, Daniel, if that was even his real name, if he ever made it down the mountain, changed his mind, or if the desert just took him and left nothing behind. I never found out who he was. Never found any article or record or even a missing persons poster that fit. And maybe that's the worst part, the not knowing. We're trained by movies and books to expect closure, an answer, a resolution. But real life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes a story just stops. I still hike sometimes, not as much as I used to, and rarely with the same sense of carefree wonder. I carry more weight now, both in my pack and in my mind. There's always a part of me that expects to find something hidden in the rocks. Another note, another clue, but I never have. Looking back, it's strange how something so quiet, so small, just 2 pieces of paper in a tin box, could stay with me for so long. Not in a haunting way, not like a ghost story, but in a human way. A reminder that everyone has their battles, and some people don't get the closure they need. And some of us just happen to find their final words when we least expect it. East Mesa always had this weird undercurrent, too. A kind of off-kilter vibe if you knew where to look. Old buildings with symbols carved into the concrete. Makeshift churches in strip malls with windows blacked out. Once, a group of us found a bunch of candles and bones arranged in a circle off one of the side trails in the desert. Animal bones, we hoped. There were rumors about cults, strange gatherings in the wash during the full moon. But who knows? Maybe it was just the desert getting into our heads. Still, when I think about that day, I don't think about the girls or the hike or the view from the summit. I think about that drawing, that caption, the last view from Daniel's eyes. I hope he found peace, wherever he ended up, and I hope my friend still has that tin, because someday someone might come looking for it, or maybe they already have. It was sometime in the mid-70s, early summer, when I took a solo hiking trip through the hills near my uncle's old property. I was in my mid-20s working a job in the city back then, and I remember I just needed to get away. Things were noisy, crowded, and the people around me all seemed to move too fast. like they were chasing something they couldn't see. So, I packed up my old canvas pack, threw in some dried food, my canteen, a knife, and a few other basics, and I headed out. The plan was simple: hike into the backcountry, camp a few nights, and just be alone with the land. The hills were soft and rolling, with wide open spaces broken up by thin lines of trees and dry creek beds. The sun that week was heavy and bright, but not too cruel, and the air still held the smell of spring. I followed game trails and old sheep paths, not in any rush, just letting the land guide me. I passed through patches of sagebrush and wildflowers, fields buzzing with flies and bees, and sometimes I'd stop just to listen to the wind push through the tall grass. On the second day, after a long morning hike, I was crossing a broad meadow near an abandoned fence line. The wire was old, sagging in places, and much of it was broken or rusted away. It looked like no one had kept livestock there in years. I didn't think much of it at first, just another forgotten mark from when the land was used harder. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a lump of dirty wool stuck in the fence. A snag maybe, where a sheep had brushed up too close and left some of its coat behind. But as I got closer, my steps slowed, and a chill began to spread across my back. It wasn't just wool. It was a sheep. It was lying on its side, half in the grass, half tangled in a fallen loop of barbed wire. The wire had wrapped around its hind leg, right up to the hip. At first glance, it looked like the leg had been stripped of wool. But when I looked closer, I realized there was no flesh left. From the hock up to the hip, it was just bone. Clean, smooth bone, pale against the dry grass. Flies swarmed around it, thick and humming. Maggots squirmed in the raw stump, crawling across what was left of the joint. The smell hit me next. Wet rot, sweet and thick, like meat left too long in the sun. The sheep turned its head slightly when I stepped closer. As I was dull, filmy, but alive. It looked at me. I stood there for a long time, not sure what to do. I couldn't look away from its face. There was no sound but the flies and the slow, shallow wheeze of its breath. It wasn't crying, it wasn't kicking. It just looked tired, hollowed out, in pain but too far gone to fight. I had no idea how long it had been there. Maybe days, maybe more. I looked at the leg again. The bone was dry in places, yellowing, but in others, the muscle had just barely rotted away, hanging in small black patches. I could see teeth marks from the flies and tiny insect trails where the skin had been eaten. The wire had dug in deep, likely stopping the bleeding early on, which might have kept it from dying outright. It had probably stood for a while before it dropped from exhaustion, and once it was down, that was it. The wire held it. The ground soaked up its strength. I had my knife with me, a simple folding blade I kept sharp. I thought for a moment about trying to free it, but there was nothing left of that leg. Even if I cut the wire away, even if I carried it out of the hills, there was no saving it. The nearest farm or town was miles away, and I had no idea who it belonged to, if anyone. The animal was suffering. I'd never killed anything bigger than a rabbit before. Hunting wasn't something I grew up doing, and even back then, I didn't think of myself as someone who could do it. But I looked at the sheep, its eyes still watching me, and I knew I couldn't walk away and leave it there. I pulled the knife out of my pocket, opened the blade, and knelt beside it. My hands were shaking. The sheep didn't flinch, didn't move. I set one hand on its neck, just under the jaw, feeling the rough wool and the thin skin beneath. I tried to do it fast. I tried to be clean. The blade went in, and the sheep jerked once, but it was quick. Blood spilled into the dry grass, and then it stopped moving. I sat there afterward, staring at my hands. The knife dropped somewhere beside me. The flies kept buzzing. The body twitched a few more times, little reflexes. I wiped my face with the back of my arm and realized I was crying. I dug a shallow hole nearby using a flat rock and my hands. The soil was dry and hard, full of stones, but I managed to clear a pit big enough for the body. I had to cut the wire from its leg with the knife, trying not to look too closely at the bone again. When I finally rolled the carcass into the hole, I noticed how light it felt. Hollow, like something already halfway gone. I buried it best I could, packed the dirt over it, pushed a few rocks on top so animals wouldn't dig it up right away. When I stood up again, my back ached, and the sun was leaning low toward the hills. That night, I set up camp by a cluster of cottonwoods, maybe a quarter-mile away. I lit a small fire and sat with my knees pulled up, not eating, not drinking, just thinking. I couldn't shake the image. That single eye looking at me, the leg stripped clean, the wire, all of it. I didn't sleep much that night. I'd close my eyes and I'd see it again. The moment my blade touched the skin, the way it breathed. I wasn't afraid of anything in the woods, not bears or cougars or coyotes. I was afraid of the quiet, the kind of quiet that holds something heavy. The next morning, I packed up and kept walking. I didn't go home right away. I spent another 3 days out there, moving further into the hills, trying to get my head straight. I saw deer, hawks, a rattlesnake stretched out on a warm rock. I found a stream and followed it until it ran dry. But that one moment followed me the whole time, still follows me. Sometimes people talk about the worst things they've seen in the woods. Weird things, scary things. I've seen some of those too. But nothing stuck with me like that sheep. It wasn't weird. It wasn't something unexplainable. It was just pain. Long, quiet pain. An animal stuck, suffering, and holding on way longer than it should have. Years later, I mentioned it to a rancher I met while working a job out west. I didn't tell him all the details, just asked how something like that could happen. He said sometimes animals get caught in old fence lines, and no one knows they're missing until it's too late. He said sheep are tough, sometimes too tough for their own good. They don't always scream or make a fuss. They just endure. That stuck with me. Endure. I think about it sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, when everything is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts. I remember the feel of the dry grass against my knees, the sound of the flies, the weight of the knife in my hand. It doesn't haunt me like a ghost story or a nightmare. It just lingers, a reminder that suffering doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it lies there, watching you, waiting for you to do the right thing. I never went back to that spot. I couldn't even tell you exactly where it was now. The land changes. Grass grows, fences fall, bones turn to dust. But I carry it with me, not because I want to, but because I should. That summer hike was supposed to be peaceful, a break from the world. In a way, it was, but it also taught me something I didn't expect. That even in the middle of nowhere, far from people and noise, there's still pain. There's still work to be done. And sometimes you're the only one there to do it. I don't regret putting the sheep down. It was the right thing, but it bothers me still. And maybe that's good. Maybe some things should bother us forever.